very comfortable kind of life. And so Elijah comes to him and says, I want you to turn your back on all of that and enter into the ministry. You're going to enter into a life of poverty. You're going to enter into a life where people are going to reject you. Kings are going to be in opposition to you. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be a hard life. And I can just imagine Elisha saying, God, I think you've made a mistake here somewhere, haven't you? Easy for him to walk away, but he doesn't. You know, we never know who is just one conversation away from making a decision for Jesus Christ. We never know who is just one conversation away from making a decision that they will volunteer or they will do something for Jesus Christ. And all they're waiting for is someone who will ask them, someone who will talk to them, someone who will share with them. And that's what Elijah did for Elisha. No pressure at all. I'm going to call you to do this. It's up to you, and it's your decision. I think churches are really good when it comes to guilt and pressure. I remember hearing the story of a church where they needed a fourth grade Sunday school teacher. And so the pastor got up one Sunday morning and he announced that they needed a fourth grade Sunday school teacher because statistics had said that, see how he said it, that fourth graders who don't have a Sunday school teacher end up with a drug problem. Well, nobody volunteered that week. So the next week he pulled up a little girl up on the stage and he said, here is Susie. She's in fourth grade and she doesn't have a Sunday school teacher. Susie, would you tell us about your drug problem today? See, we're good at guilt, aren't we? We're good at putting pressure on. But Elijah didn't do that. Well, Elisha walks away, and so they walks away from his family and his vocation. And to do this, as they often do, he wants to mark this occasion. And the best way to do that is with a meal. And so Elisha throws a big barbecue. He burns those the implements of the tools that he had. It creates a fire. Do you know how much meat is in a side of beef? Now imagine 24 sides of beef. And verse 21 says that's a lot of people. Verse 21 says, and then he set out to follow Elijah, and he became his attendants. 2 Kings chapter 2. Elijah and Elisha have been together for a long time, and it said when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way to Gilgal. And it's somewhat of a strange journey. Gilgal is over near the Jordan River. And so Elijah says to Elisha in verse 2, you stay here, for the Lord has sent me on to Bethel. Bethel is about halfway between where he is and the Mediterranean Sea. And Elisha says, no, nothing doing. As sure as the Lord lives and as you live, I'm not going to leave you alone. And so he goes with him, and they go to Bethel. And then he says, I want you to stay here. I'm going to move ahead. And the same conversation. And this time he goes to Jericho. And then the same conversation. And this time he goes over to the Jordan River. In other words, Elisha keeps saying, whatever it is that you're going to face, I'm going to be there to face it with you. And then in verse 8, Elijah took his cloak. That's the same cloak that he had spread over Elisha a long time ago. And he rolled it up and he struck the water with it. And just like Moses had experienced and just like Joshua had experienced, the water divided and they walked over to the other side. And when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me what I can do for you before I am taken away from you. In other words, what is it that you need to soar? What is it that you need from me that's going to help you to be successful as I pass this torch to you? And he says, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. And for some, they look at that and say what he's saying is, I want a double portion of whatever it is that you've got. I want to work twice as many miracles as you do. I want to be twice as famous as you are. No, that's not what he's saying. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, it lays out the inheritance laws for us. And it says that the oldest child is the heir who will receive the double portion. And so when someone asks to receive a double portion of the inheritance, what they're asking is, I want to be your heir. I want to be that one in line in your family. I want to be your son. So Elisha says, I've watched you over the years. I've watched how you have served God. I have watched how you've loved God. I've watched how you have dealt with the people of Israel. I have seen all of the idolatry that is in this nation, and I want to do something about it just like you've done something about it, and I cannot do that on my own strength. I want a double portion of the Holy Spirit. And Elijah said in verse 10, you've asked a difficult thing. I'm not in charge of who gets the Spirit and who doesn't. But then he says, if you see me when I am taken from you, then it will be yours. Otherwise, not. And as they were walking along together, beautiful picture, these two servants of God walking together. And then God sends a limo down for Elijah. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went to heaven in a whirlwind. He and Enoch were the only two who had that kind of affirmation of life taken into heaven. And Elisha cried, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel. And Elisha saw him no more. Elijah, a man with a mantle, who had believed in him, had prayed for him, who had chosen him, he was gone. And he would never see him again. And he took hold of his own clothes and he tore them apart. It's a sign of grief. And he picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah, and he went back and he stood on the bank of the Jordan. And then he took the cloak that had fallen from him and he struck the water with it, and he said, now, where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? He's still leaning on the faith of Elijah. And the water parts, just like it did for Moses and for Joshua and Elijah. Elisha will go on to live an extraordinary life. In chapter 3, he will be the advisor to kings, telling them how to do strategy for battle, at times even challenging them. In chapter 4, he comes across a widow who has 2 sons, and she is so far in debt that her sons are about to be sold into slavery in order to pay that debt. And so he says to her, go around and ask all of your neighbors for some empty jars. And I love this, verse 3. He says, and don't ask for just a few. Don't ask for just a few. Because when you give God a few jars, guess what? He'll fill a few jars. But when you give God a lot of jars, he'll fill a lot of jars. And that's exactly what he did. And then God filled those, and Elisha said, go and sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on what is left behind. And so you get this picture of Elisha, who has built into these kings before him, and now he's building into this family, this widow and her 2 sons. Verse 38, Elisha returned to Gilgal, and there was a famine in that region, and while the company of the prophets were meeting with him, he said to his servant, put on a large pot and cook some stew for this company. And so one of them went out into the field and gathered herbs and found a wild vine, and he gathered some of its gourds, and he filled the folds of his cloak. And when he returned, he put them into the pot of stew, though no one knew what they were. The stew was poured out for the people, and they began to eat it, and they cried out, oh, man of God, there is death in this pot. Has anybody ever said that about your cooking? It was bad. They could not eat it. And so Elisha took some flour, had them mix it in. It changed the whole flavor and everything of the stew, and they were able to eat it. He was building into the lives of these prophets, letting them know that God was always at work. Another generation passing the torch. And then the last story, 2 Kings chapter 6. The king of Aram wants to kill the king of Israel. And so Elisha is his advisor, and so he tells the king of Israel, you need to keep moving. You need to keep moving. And he does. In verse 11 it says, this enraged the king of Aram, and he asked all of his officers, which one of you is a mole? Who's telling who is telling everyone in Israel what's going on? And they said, none of us, my lord, the king. It's Elisha, the prophet, who is in Israel. He tells the king of Israel the very words that you're speaking in your bedroom. Kind of a divine wiretap. And the king of Aram hears that Elisha is going to Dothan. And so it says he sent his horses and his chariots and a strong force there. And they went by night and they surrounded the city. And they had one intent, and that is they're going to kill Elisha. Verse 15. When the servant of the man of God got up and went out the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. The Armenians were all around. "Oh, my Lord, what shall we do?" the servant asked. "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Kind of sounded strange. And so Elisha prayed, "Oh Lord, open his eyes so that he may see." And then the Lord opened his servant's eyes, and he looked, and he saw hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Can you imagine what that moment was like? Elisha was building into the life of his servant, praying for him, lifting him up, giving him faith and courage. Now there's a little postscript of this story I think is kind of neat. Verse 18. Elisha prays that this army will be struck with blindness, and they are. All of the people in the enemy army are blind. And so Elisha goes up to them because he knows that they're looking for him. And he says, "Well, this is not the road and this is not the city. Follow me and I will lead you to the man you're looking for." And he leads him straight to Samaria, which is the capital of Israel. After they had entered, Elisha said, "Lord, open the eyes of these people so that they can see." And the Lord opened their eyes, and they looked. And there they were, the last place they would ever want to be, inside the walls of the city of Samaria. And when the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, "Shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them?" "Do not kill them," he answered. "Would you kill those who have captured you with your own sword or bow? Instead, set food and water before them so that they may eat and drink, and then go back to their master." Shall I kill them? No. Have a cookout. You know, Elisha loves barbecues. Have a cookout. And so he prepared a great feast for them in verse 23. And after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master, and the bands of Aram stopped raiding into Israel's territory. Kings and widows and sons and prophets and armies, all of them were changed. And it all happened because there was one man passing along down the road, stopped, and looked over and saw a man plowing in the field, and took his mantle and went over and put it around him and passed the torch to him. And so now here we are, thousands of years later, and the torch is still being passed. The people that I read off their names a few moments ago, they were all torch passers. They passed the torch to us. And so my question for us is, who are we passing the torch on to? Who are you encouraging in their faith? Who have you invited to come alongside of you and to learn and to grow? See, I believe God's dream for reaching the world rests on this very thing, us passing the torch. And the future of the church rests on this very thing also, us passing the torch. As I look around, I know that, and I can say your devotion to this has been remarkable. You've spent time in the nursery rocking babies, and you have taught children Bible stories, and you have stayed up late on youth retreats, living off of pizza and Coke. And you have taught our young adults how to climb on roofs and replace shingles for leaking roofs for people who can't afford it. You've done that for the next generation. And every generation has that decision to make. How are we going to pass the torch, and how are we going to do it? The reality is that the number of people who are committed to passing the torch, that number is declining. And the number of people who are not willing to receive the torch, that number is increasing. And we could probably say we're one generation from extinction. But I believe that God will always have a church. And God will always have a people. People who are committed. It may not look like what it looks like today, but you can't crush God's dream. And I know that passing the torch looks different today than it did just even a decade or a couple of decades ago. Programming has changed. The way people respond to Jesus Christ has changed. And sometimes we say, well, you know, I'm just too old to do this. Physically, I can't do it. I used to be able to do it. I don't have the resources to do it anymore. I just can't. I understand that. But nowhere in the Scriptures do I ever find anyone who had the honor of retiring and stepping aside and doing nothing. And so I want to give two challenges to us. One of them is that by the end of the year, every one of us who calls Monte Vista their home will be involved in some kind of ministry where they are being involved in passing the torch. It can be part of something that's happening in this congregation. It can be something that's happening in the community. It could be something that we do from our homes. It could be something that we do as, intentionally praying or intentionally giving. But we are saying, I'm going to be a part of passing the torch, and here's what I can do. And everyone in our church committed to doing that. Keepers of the flame and passers of the torch. The second challenge is that it's hard to pass the torch if you don't have a base of people to pass the torch onto. And our base is small. Children and students and young adults. But we do have a base. You may not see them here on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, but we have a base. And they need to be heard. And we need to be listening. And we need to be bending over backwards. And we need to be supporting and doing whatever we can in those ministries to reach that next generation. Because that's what it means to pass the torch. And that means doing what we have always done. Make sacrifices, give up some of our preferences, set aside some of our time, set aside some of our money. It may mean a lot of things, but it means that we believe in those who are coming after us. And we believe that God has called us to be keepers of the flame and passers of the torch. And we got to do it. For that was exactly what Jesus did for us. He called us to be his apprentices who would one day, and he handed the torch to us, and he said, I want you to pass that torch to those who will come after you. And every time we gather around this table, we're reminded of who we are and who we have been called to be. I'm going to ask those who are going to serve if they will come, and we're going to close our service out with sharing in this time around God's table, a table that he invites all to come, and those of us who have made that commitment to be his apprentice. And when we take that bread and we dip it in this cup, we are affirming that call that he has on us, and that we're also going to be today passers of that torch. And so in a moment, I'll invite you to come forward and to come down this center aisle, if you will.
In remembrance of me.
Would you stand? Would you come, please?
Eat this bread. In remembrance of me. Drink this wine. In remembrance of me. Pray for the time when God's own will is done. In remembrance of me, heal the sick. In remembrance of me, feed the poor. In remembrance of me, open the door and let your brother in. Let him in. Take, eat, and be comforted. shed for in remembrance of me. Church, in remembrance of me, always love. In remembrance of me, don't look above, but in your heart, look in your heart for God. Do this in remembrance of me.
Remember his body broken for you.
Because he loves you so much.
Amen. Thank you. And Dan and Simeon, the body of Christ broken for you, and the blood of Christ shed for you. As we close today, I'm going to ask you to ask God to, if you don't have this person already, to ask God to bring someone in your life or someone in your mind, to your mind, who needs to have the torch passed to them. And then let's see how God opens doors this week for us to do that very thing. You've got a great light, so go and share it. Thank you. We'll see you next time.